Joining us in the now is Tatiana Pushnova, the executive producer of Ukraine Today.
That's why I don't want to communicate with you, and I call to my international colleague, don't cooperate with Russia today.
Could you just tell us a little bit more about... Okay, very good. Okay.
The war in Ukraine has also become a war with information. It has led to diplomatic coldness between Russia and many Western countries. So for this episode, we want to look at some of the reasons behind the conflict and what interests are at stake. This is Ukraine Mapped. Like other former socialist countries, Ukraine is in many ways torn between the West, the path that many of its neighbors' countries have taken, and the East, that has heavily influenced the country for decades. Here, we see the Warsaw Pact in red and NATO in green during the Cold War, with the Iron Curtain separating East and West. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were military defense treaties that protect each other and station soldiers in each other's countries. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO has been expanding east despite former agreements. The European Union is also reaching out to former Soviet countries, making Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova the only European countries that were formerly Soviet that haven't joined the EU or NATO yet. NATO and the EU expansion threatens Russia. In 2008, Ukraine applied for NATO membership, and if that had happened, American soldiers could have been stationed right at the border to Russia. This turns to a challenge for Ukraine. The population is very split over the question whether to join the European Union or strengthen its ties with Russia. To see how split the country is, let's look at their 2010 presidential election between Yulia Tymoshenko, who strives for Ukraine to become a NATO and EU member, and Viktor Yanukovych, who instead saw the country's future closer tied to Russia. Tymoshenko received majority votes in the western part of the country. Yanukovych, however, received more votes, most of them being in the eastern regions of the country. During his presidency, he stopped the country's plans to join NATO and positioned Ukraine closer to Russia, while at the same time expressing the importance of Ukraine's independence. In 2013, his course led to Euromaidan protests. The people, most prominently in Ukraine's capital Kiev, wanted Yanukovych to step down. They drew attention to corruption and human rights violations under Yanukovych's presidency and expressed their wish for European integration. The situation escalated greatly, and it came to armed fights and shootings between protesters and police on Maidan Square. Yanukovych was removed from office. It's up to debate whether this was unconstitutional. Yanukovych then sought asylum in Russia. Ukraine was then ruled by an interim government until a new president was elected. In the meantime, this conflict was used by people in the eastern parts of the country, one of them being Sergei Aksyonov, who overthrew the prime minister of the region, Crimea, and gained power. Crimea has changed its status between Russia and Ukraine several times during its history. Therefore, its Russian influence is extremely high. We can see this by looking at a map showing the languages majorly spoken in the country. Aksyonov called Russian President Putin for help, who then stepped in and increased Russian troops on the peninsula, disarming the Ukrainian military and organizing a referendum over the future of Crimea. An act seen by many Western countries as a violation of international law. The citizens majorly voted for Crimea to become a part of the Russian Federation, and de facto it is. However, the majority of the countries do not accept the legitimacy of the referendum, considering it was held under military pressure. In the meantime, a new president, Petro Poroshenko, was elected in Kiev, an oligarch who condemns Russia's involvement in eastern Ukraine. Following Crimea's annexation in March 2014, several pro-Russian groups in the Ukrainian regions Luhansk and Donetsk protested for separation from Kiev. These regions, also called Donbass, have a large Russian population that has felt discriminated against by the Ukrainian government for decades. This turned into a civil war between Ukrainian government forces and separatists that were backed and armed by Russia. Thousands of people died in the civil war over the course of the year until world leaders came together in Minsk to negotiate a ceasefire between rebels and the government. But ever since, the ceasefire is unstable and gets broken by both sides often. Developments in Ukraine are important to Europe, since Ukraine would be a good trade partner for the European Union. It would also make it the biggest country in the EU if it were to join. However, Ukraine is also significantly important to Russia. The country is highly dependent on its oil and gas industry, which most of is being pumped to Europe through the pipelines across Ukraine and Belarus. Also, Russia is forming its own trade union, the Eurasian Economic Union, similar to the EU. If Ukraine were to join, it would be the third biggest member of that union. and not to forget that keeping Ukraine away from the West is in Russia's interest to keep the buffer zone between NATO and its country. The future developments in Ukraine will be significantly important for the relationship between the European Union, the United States, and Russia. The citizens will have hard choices to make in the future. To choose between NATO and Russia, to choose between the European Union and the Eurasian Union, and to choose between the country's unity or separation. No matter what happens, it will affect us all.